Follow me down this road. We won't get lost 'cause I know just where to go.
Hello and welcome to Raise a Glass. I am Hunter Danson.
And I am Eric Lintela.
And this is the podcast where we discuss the stories and storytellers that shape us. And we're going to be talking about After the Last Border by Jessica Goudeau. It is about refugees and more. But before we get to that, I have to know what's in your glass, Eric.
Hunter, inside of my jelly mug, it says, "You complete me." There's another one that has peanut butter on it. It's adorable. I have a lemon ginger herbal tea with honey. My voice isn't feeling great today. And so hoping that helps soothe the voice as we speak.
All right.
What is in your glass?
I have a white Tide Belgian style ale from Aldi. I was looking at the bottle, and I believe it's actually bottled in Rochester, New York. So, yeah. It's all right. I didn't look too closely at the label when I bought it. I just it's a Belgian style, like fat tire. I kind of miss having fat tires, but it has like citrus and orange peel in it or something, and I'm usually not a huge fan of that, but it's all right. It's pretty easy drinking. So, what more can you ask from your beer? But I got to know: are you pouring one out, or raising a glass to anything this week?
Yes.
I should say, what are you pouring one out or raising one? Because we always pour one out or raise one.
Yeah, we say it that way every week, but in reality, we always, with you. I'll start with what I'm pouring one out for, because I need to show you a video of what I'm raising a glass to.
Okay.
And I don't know how well it's going to transfer, but I am pouring one out to allergies. Oh my goodness. I feel like my body's being hit pretty hard by them this year.
Yeah.
And I just want it to be like a specific season, and that season being spring and not winter anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's part of I really think that's the main piece about my throat hurting and everything. Is that change of season, the pollen. I love flowers. I love trees, but I'm not a big fan of allergies.
Yeah.
And I am raising a glass to a game that I played at a camp last week called crate stacking. Have you heard of this, Hunter? Have you ever crate stacked?
No.
Okay, let me walk you through the premise for all of those listeners at home, seeing as how you will not be able to see this video, which is I'm going to show to Hunter, but we will probably skip ahead on. The premise of crate stacking is you're in a team of two. So Hunter, you and I are a team.
Okay.
And we have each other. We have one belay with a harness, and one person is harnessed in and belayed. And we have a bunch of milk crates, those black crates with all the, that you pick up and you put milk in.
Yeah.
That's the premise. So those are the materials. And one person's job is to put the milk crates in two stacks next to each other. Mm-hmm. And the other person's job is to stand on them. And so you are slowly stacking crates on top of each other. And as you're doing it, the person who's standing on them is getting higher and higher into the air. And you eventually hit a point, if you're doing it well enough, where the stacker can no longer stack the crates. And instead they have to throw the crates up to the person who is standing on them so they can catch them and put them down so they can stand and move between them.
So do you have like 2 stacks going?
Yes. So imagine like 2 parallel towers touching each other.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
That is the entire premise of it. I will show you just one quick picture of it. That is me in the bottom.
Wow.
That's relatively early on in the process. And then Hunter, I'm going to just show you a video just because I think it's hilarious.
Wow.
So this is my friend Chris. He is 19 crates high at this point, and I am chucking milk crates as high as possible. It's probably about 25 feet in the air.
Yeah, that is very high.
I can't really see him as I'm throwing them.
Yeah.
Because I throw it to him and then I try to hold the stack so he doesn't fall.
Mm-hmm. Not to be attempted without a bungee.
Correct. He is currently doing this, stepping onto his 20th crate.
Wow. Ooh, nice catch. Oh!
And that is crate stacking. It is exhilarating. If they had it at a camp that I went to growing up, I think I would have been there every day. But having a group of people primarily in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s doing it, let's just say the record for this camp is set by a 12-year-old who's tiny, and has a low center of gravity and can.
Makes sense.
He got 29 crates high.
Wow.
It was probably over 40 feet in the air.
Yeah, that is very high to be standing on milk crates.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I got. So that's what I'm raising a glass to. I think it's a very unique and fun thing.
Yeah. Great
What
stuff.
about you, Hunter?
Well, I'll let my pour one out first. I'm pouring one out for the crafting system in Horizon Forbidden West, which, if you listened to our author interview, you know that I raised a glass to Horizon Forbidden West, because it is very fun. It's a sequel to Horizon Zero Dawn, which I absolutely adored. But they added in a ton of stuff in Forbidden West, which is cool, but in my opinion, they added way too much to the point where in order to get when you get a weapon, you have to upgrade it. And the amount of resources that they require of you to upgrade this weapon has like 4 different levels. It's just it's just insane. Like to the point where when I boot up the game, I feel like I have like a chore list. And that's just not how I want to feel when I'm playing a game. Especially, maybe it's just because I'm old and I'm a dad and I don't have as much time to play video games. But like, it's really kind of draining on me. And I'm conflicted because I really like it and I love the first one a lot. And I didn't have that problem in the first one. Like the progression was great. But the crafting system it's just too much. Too much. I don't know what I'm gonna probably just stop playing. But I already beat the main story, but I wanted to do all the side activities and upgrade my gear. But it's just
You're one of those people.
Yeah, for certain games, like
I don't, but sure. I know that there are people like you. I don't understand the type of people, but
well, I do it selectively. Like for Horizon, I will because I really like Horizon and I think it's worth it. But other games, I don't know. I just avoid them.
Are you raising a glass to anything?
Yes. I am raising a glass to A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare. My wife and I have been reading it, and we watched the movie with Stanley Tucci as Puck. It was great, pretty great movie, pretty great adaptation.
Stanley Tucci's amazing.
Yeah, he's great. They add bicycles and opera, like Italian opera, Renaissance stuff, and it works. It works really well, and it's great. And I just wanted to share a line from it, and this is Robin Goodfellow as a Puck or hobgoblin in Oberon's service. And this is when he is correcting his mistake because he puts some love juice on the wrong lover's eyes. And that's how the whole mix-up happens. And but he's correcting his mistake here, and he says, "When thou wakest, thou takest true delight in the sight of thy former lady's eye, and the country proverb known, that every man should take his own, in your waking shall be shown. Jack shall have Jill, naught shall go ill. The man shall have his mare again, and all shall be well." It's a comedy, not a tragedy.
It's a good follow-up to Hadestown.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Hunter.
Yeah.
Hunter, I am very excited to talk about this book. I think I first brought it to your attention 2 or 3 months ago, right?
Yeah. We were talking.
So,
I think we were talking about things to do for season 2. Things to do when we got back from the hiatus.
Yeah. And so you finished reading it probably a few weeks ago, right?
I did, yeah. Yep.
And I've read it 1 and a third times. And I'm kind of working through a kind of a second and a third time, maybe, which I'll explain in a second. Well, actually, why don't I explain it now? Just let me give a quick overview of this book.
Mm-hmm.
There are too many pieces to kind of go super in depth. But After the Last Border, Two Families, and the Story of Refuge in America is a combination of 3 separate stories brought together through a series of interviews and really friendship over multiple months and years. Jessica Goudeau tells the story of Muna, a woman from Myanmar who's resettled in Texas with her husband and her kids. And it's primarily her story in the United States. There's some reference to prior to them being resettled in the United States, but most of her story is arriving and what happened afterwards. The second story is that of Hasna, a Syrian refugee, and her story is primarily set prior to arriving in the United States. While Muna has a husband and a couple kids at the beginning of the story, Hasna is a grandma with 5 kids, one of whom is pretty young, and multiple grandkids. And it's her experience and their experience as I think the appropriate word would be genocide, internal war in Syria was beginning, and the way that impacted her and her family, and then her arrival in the United States. And then the third story is the story of refugee resettlement in the United States dating back to 1880. And so it's these three pieces, Muna, Hasna, and the history of refugee resettlement, that Jessica Goudeau intertwines. And as an individual who works in refugee resettlement, that is my part of my profession. I had this recommended to me by a coworker in a different state whose language was, this is a book that everybody who works in refugee resettlement should read. I would push it a step further, and I'm sure she would agree, that this is a book that everybody should read. It is not an easy book to read by any means, and we'll discuss that. But it is so effective at taking the current climate, political climate, climate around refugees, and solidifying it into a history, and then showing the way that human stories are impacted, while not reducing the agency of the primary characters. Muna and Hasna are real people. That is not their real names. Their identities have been protected. And I'm so excited to bring this to us today. I'm so excited to hear your thoughts on it, Hunter. There are many ways we could go in this conversation. For those of you listeners who know nothing about refugee resettlement, welcome. I'm hoping over the next many seasons of this podcast, you'll get to learn a little bit more. I can share a little bit more of my world with you. And really, when I say my world, I'm thinking more in terms of the stories that I get to walk alongside.
Do you want to talk a little about what you do? Just for some context.
Sure. I work at a refugee resettlement agency in Rochester, New York. And my role is to connect churches and communities, partners, whether it be schools or businesses or individuals, with newly arrived refugees and other immigrants. I am continually speaking at different groups and trying to grow a broader vision for what it would look like if the greater Rochester area, really the entirety of Western New York, was known as a place of welcome and as a place of love for everyone. And I'm thinking specifically in terms of refugees and other immigrants. We can talk about legal definitions at some point if you want to, but I do choose my words purposefully. Mm-hmm. The organization I work for is World Relief, which is an incredible organization. We work here in Western New York, as well as 15 or 16 different offices across the United States, as well as currently we've got offices in 13 countries. Responding to more than mass displacement, responding to extreme poverty, to war and disaster. Actually, our second largest office is in Sudan right now. So we're spending time praying and lifting up our friends and brothers and sisters in Sudan in the midst of this really dangerous and terrible last 3 weeks of fighting.
Well, thank you for bringing this to the podcast. I was very glad that I read it. This style of the writing is very easy to read. She writes in a journalistic style, just very clear, very precise,
very emotive.
but it's emotionally it's very hard to read, just because of the things that Muna and Hasna go through. And it does a very good job of connecting. I mean, for me, the special thing that it did was connect real people to the word refugee. And I think especially Hasna's story for me, because I remember hearing about the Arab Spring, and the man who set himself on fire, and all of that. I remember when it was on the news, and kind of ashamed to admit I didn't really think too hard about it. There wasn't much I could do. I couldn't vote. Definitely prayed, I think, at the time, but I think the thing I was thinking about was when you hear that someone set themselves on fire as an act of protest. And this book made it more clear, like, what would have to happen to me in order for me to consider setting myself on fire. And Hasna, she's not really an activist, which I think is it. She's not really an activist. She is just trying to keep her family together. And in spite of her best efforts, she's not able to keep everyone together. And she gets a lot of them out, and she herself survives. But her story's not done. Like I was reading the epilogue, and
yes, I want to get there in this. This is not a story with a bow on it that will make you feel good, because it's real human lives, and these aren't real human lives that lived at a different time. These are people that are alive now, that are undergoing many challenges that you and I can't understand.
Yeah.
And hopefully nobody else ever has to. But that's not actually the reality of what's happening in our world.
Yeah. If you still have a heart, this book will break it. And I think also, like, it's so easy to get jaded just reading the news. I know I don't really stay, quote unquote, in touch with the news as often as I should, just because it's so exhausting. But when it's a human story, it's almost impossible not to connect to it. And then the other part of the book that I really appreciated was the part you told me not to read. I didn't have to read it.
Yes, it wasn't because I didn't think it was important, but because I wanted you to feel like you could get through.
Yeah. It's not super long, but again, it's not emotionally the easiest thing to read. So, but the kind of interspersed through Muna and Hasna's stories are sort of like history and summary of the U.S. resettlement program and refugee resettlement program and in general. And one of the things that stuck out to me, I think that I'll remember for a long time, is the summary of American attitudes towards refugees. in the history of restrictionists versus I forget the language. Liberalizers, yes. Restrictionists are better safe than sorryists.
I hate that language, and also found it. Do you want to describe better safe than sorryism?
Yeah, so let me find some. Better safe than sorryism was the staple of such groups as the American First Committee, or the America First Committee, established in 1940. Their spokesman, Charles Lindbergh, used blatant anti-Semitic language in Iowa in 1941 to argue that the greatest danger to this country comes from the, quote, large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, or our radio and our government of, quote, the Jewish. As he framed it, these, quote, war agitators pushed the U.S. to enter the conflict for reasons which are not American. That was in 1940. And we still have echoes of that. And it was good to see the back and forth throughout history, because when I was in high school, I had this view of America that maybe I wanted to have, and it was defined by the Statue of Liberty. Give me, you're restless, you're poor, yearning to breathe free. And I think what I didn't realize is that the Statue of Liberty was kind of like a statement. It was a push for more openness in the face of restrictionists who wanted to close America. And this book gives a nice history of the real struggle to accept refugees and to welcome people to America when, I think a lot of Americans, especially in the church, like to think of America as a very, we talk about immigrants and how they built the country and how America is a great melting pot and how that's all wonderful. But we're also incredibly hypocritical. And we have historically not always been welcoming.
It's also important to note with what you shared, Hunter, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds. I actually would recommend people to read this, just because we can't dive into the entire history. Right. That the restrictionists and liberalizers have historically not simply been Republicans and Democrats. There's actually a switch that happened at one point in the United States history. And around refugee resettlement specifically, which is what this book focuses on, 1980 was an incredibly important year, because that is the point in which the current refugee resettlement system, under which we still operate, was established by Jimmy Carter during his presidency. And it's so important because through that process, there was a very robust resettlement response from the United States saying, hey, we need to be a place of welcome, while simultaneously the follow through of what that looks like can feel like not nearly enough. And that's very clear as you read Munaz and Hasna's story. And it's this really huge tension in which refugee resettlement agencies live in. because we received funding for the first 90 days of a family arriving in the United States to resettle them. And that's not a lot of time, and we don't receive a lot of funds. And we want to help people as quickly as possible get to a place where they can be self-sufficient and thrive here, or here being wherever they live in the United States. And I think of myself during COVID, March, April, and May of 2020, and how effective was I, at getting anything done? And now saying, okay, or maybe a better example, moving, even within the United States, those first 3 months, is the challenge of that. Now imagine you're moving across the world. You don't have any connections in this space. You don't speak the language. You don't understand the culture. You might never have driven a car before or really understand modern technology, not through any fault of your own. And you are holding on to this often major traumatic events that are continually impacting you mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, if not physically, as well as any physical wounds you might hold from the events that led you to the United States.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And it's the reason I love this type of work, and I think it's very clear in this story, is because we, as welcomers, we as part of the church specifically, can look at the person in front of us, are commanded to look at the person in front of us and to love them for no other reason than that they were made in God's image, and we were called to do it because Jesus did it. And that is it, period. And what a beautiful image when we see that done. And I can think of stories where that's done. And what a transformative power that has. At one point in Munah's story, she interacts, she starts working at a pretty much a fair trade organization, that works with fair trade goods. And her first day, she's like, oh my goodness, I don't understand any of this. Munah, turns out, is absolutely brilliant and has an incredible mind for languages. I want to be like her and her ability to pick up languages. I just don't understand how she could do it. And she talks about her fear in the first day. And then she connects with a coworker who's like, I remember being terrified on the first day. And she's like, what? But you're white, you're of this culture. Like, how in the world were you scared? And they end up forming a relationship and friendship. And it not only transforms Munah's work, but through that and through her becoming more settled in who she is, it also transforms her marriage, and transforms their family. And that's one of those things that hit me so much is Munah's relationship with Sakhe. I love reading it, even though it was really hard. And I was like, wow, this is what a marriage sounds like. Marriages aren't easy. They're full of ups and downs. Not easy
in the best of times.
Yes. And now, let's throw one of the pieces of Munah's story is her and her husband Sakhe were them and their two kids at the time were one of the very first Burmese families to be resettled in the United States. Period. And that's an especially challenging thing because there's not a community of people with the same background to welcome you. Instead, they had to pretty much become that community to welcome others. And the challenges of finding jobs, and there were a couple people, but to welcome them. Hunter, I would love if there are specific thoughts you have, quotes, parts of the stories that stuck out to you, or questions you have for me. We talk a little bit about, I talk about my job in our conversations, and exciting things. But if there are things you're like, hey, tell me about this, or what did you think about this part of the story, or whatever, I would love to discuss it with you.
Okay. What's the difference between a refugee and an immigrant?
Hunter, I think that's a really important question because there's a lot of misinformation that exists in our country, and there's a lot of polarized views based off of misinformation. And the legal definition of a refugee, and this legal definition matters because if somebody receives the legal designation of being a refugee, their opportunities change. But the legal definition of a refugee, and it's true for both Hasna and Muna in the story, is an individual who's fleeing war, violence, or persecution based off of their race, religion, political opinion, social class, or social group, or nationality. And so if somebody, in order to be a refugee, you need to be really fleeing, and you need to be outside of your country of origin. So, Hunter, if you are fleeing persecution while you're in the United States, but you are still within the United States, you are not considered a refugee. You are considered a forcibly displaced person. Actually, that is the larger, I think of it, the larger rectangle that holds all the small squares. You would even more specifically be considered an internally displaced person within the broad field of forcibly displaced people. If you got outside of the United States, let's say to Canada, fleeing persecution, and you would at that point be an asylum seeker. All refugees were at one point asylum seekers. And as an asylum seeker, you're pretty much saying, hey, I'm claiming that I meet the legal definition of a refugee, but I'm seeking to be welcomed in this country. This is where things can get a little bit confusing around international law. But it's important to still, because there's no fully legal definition of an asylum seeker. But it is kind of what I just shared. And at that point, if your asylum case is granted, in the sense that you will then be seeking the status of being resettled in a different country, you'd be considered a refugee. If you were then granted and seeking to be resettled in the country where you are, you'd be called an asylee. All of this gets more and more complicated, and I can go into even further definitions of humanitarian parolees, and other legal statuses. But the important thing to know about refugees specifically is that nobody chooses to be a refugee. You are forced to be a refugee. Nobody chooses to flee their home when there's persecution or violence or war. It is something you have to do. You might not do it right away. That's actually a large part of Hasna's story, them trying to go and come back. But if you are a refugee, you've had to flee. And if you are ultimately a refugee who's then resettled in the United States, you would fall into the even larger category of immigrant. But for the sake of this particular book, we're talking about the refugee process. And one of the biggest changes that happened that this book talks about, which will then hopefully lead us into the discussion of Hasna and Munah, is that around 2016, there was a conflation of the term refugee and immigrant. And this isn't exactly what the book says, but this is kind of one of my readings of it. One that in this conflation took what had historically been at least since the 1980s, a bipartisan agreement to welcome refugees. And there's great statistical backups to walk through this economically and safety wise and other things. And it became partisan, and all immigrants were thrown in the same bucket. And because of the way refugee resettlement works in the United States, the United States president has almost complete ownership over the number of refugees resettled in the United States in a given year. It is the single aspect of immigration that the United States president holds the most power over. And so when what had historically been bipartisan became partisan and full of misinformation, full of better than safe than sorryism, full of fear-based decisions, full of this broken understanding of the perception of us being a welcoming country versus the reality of us not, then decisions were made that impacted real people's lives and very drastically impacted Hasna's life. Hunter, I'd love to talk about Hasna and her story. Are there any questions you have of what I just shared? Any pieces you're like, ooh, you said something that made me feel really uncomfortable.
Didn't make me uncomfortable, but there's definitely people out there who might have objections, but this is our podcast, so
I tried my best to speak in terms of facts. I'm sure some of my own opinions came into that as well, but this is a challenging thing because the work around refugees is a very specific work, and yet it as a person who does this work, it also colors my views of all immigration, and I'm glad it does.
I think this is a good transition. One of the things about Hasna's story that you learn is the astonishing amount of paperwork and research and investigation that refugee organizations do into refugees. Like Hasna, it took them years just to be considered for resettlement. Years. And one of the things that she talks about in reference to what happened to the refugee program in 2016 and politics is that refugee became a word, went from being people had a favorable view of refugees. The word refugee was evoked, noble sympathy. And it became for a certain faction, a derogatory term.
Yeah. Hunter, you talked about that paperwork and about how long it took. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, is the organization that designates people as refugees. Pretty much they hear and they say, yes, you are a refugee in their cases, or no, there's not enough evidence. And that's a long process. At one point in that process, a refugee is then told, hey, you will be resettled. Does not happen very often. And of that, then an even smaller percentage are told, hey, you're going to be resettled in the United States. Then the United States does its own background screenings, which is a lot of what we were reading in Hasna's story. Andrew, do you want to hazard a guess at how long, on average, the United States screening process for refugees takes?
2 years?
2 to 3 years. 2 to 3 years after they've already been screened by the United Nations. An additional 2 to 3 years. Follow-up question. Knowing that information, hearing a little bit about these stories, how long, on average, do you think people are refugees?
How long?
Sorry, do you think people are in refugee camps?
Camps? Oh, 10 years.
17 years.
Oof.
The average stay of a refugee in a refugee camp in our world is 17 years.
Moon Na spent most of she grew up in a refugee camp.
Yeah, she grew up in multiple.
Yeah.
Right? She moved around a little bit too. One other question, and then kind of, because these are pieces, you're doing a great job, Hunter.
Thanks.
What percentage of refugees do you think are resettled anywhere in the world?
Anywhere.
Anywhere.
20%.
Less than 1% of refugees are ever resettled. In fact, the current goal of the United Nations is to increase that percentage to 1% of the current refugees a year being resettled anywhere in the world. Just an idea of kind of what that means. The current number of refugees in the world is 32 million. And they're part of this larger group of forcibly displaced people in the world that is over 100 million. And these numbers have skyrocketed in the 2000s because of global conflicts, because of various wars and ongoing civil wars, and COVID, and other climate change factors that are impacting things that wouldn't create somebody being a refugee, but would make them have to leave their home possibly. And so this is a type of information that I think can help change minds. But it might be able to change minds, but it won't change hearts. Hasna seemed to have like an epic life.
Yeah.
Prior to the civil war, in Syria, she lived in a cool city and like an old family home. This talks about one of her daughters, like she was. I think you said this earlier, Hunter. What was the specific wording? She's not an activist, but like her goal is to keep her family together. But it's like she has a little bit activist traits inside of her, and like her big thing was her 3 daughters needed to graduate from high school.
Right.
Something that she wasn't able to do, and that many other women in that country at that time weren't able to do. She said, no, my daughters are getting their high school diplomas. And it was hard for that to happen, right? Where her one daughter, Layla, like, who seemed really cool, like, got married and was pregnant, and like her and her husband had to move out of his family's house because like he had agreed with Hasna, Layla's mom, right, the primary character, that Layla would get her degree, graduate from high school Otherwise, Hasna had the ability to end the marriage, which is crazy. Again, in that specific culture, in that specific time. But also Layla and what is his name?
Malik?
Malik. Oh,
Malik.
who just seemed like the most wonderful man ever. They loved each other so much.
Yeah.
They love each other so much, and like their story is one of deep passion and love for each other. I'm trying to figure out how much of this story we should give away versus not.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like we just want to convince people to go and read it. I think that's always
The audio version of this, the audible version of this is amazing. It's a long book. It's a long book, right? There's three big stories that are being told. It's not a long book, but it's a long book.
It's like 300 pages, right?
I found myself crying throughout so much of it. I'm going through the references right now. It is 300 pages. And it's not always crying because it's sad, but also crying because of the hope and the love that shows up in the midst of it. In addition to the pain. And there is loss. There are members. There are real people that die in this story. And there are also real people that fall in love in the story. And I think we have this thought sometimes as Americans that people want to be in the United States. Like everybody's goal in the world is to live in the United States, and that refugees in particular would love to live in the United States.
Right.
And it's not always not the case. You know, sometimes there is an aspect of that is true. Mm-hmm. But that's often very much not the primary narrative that is in people's lives. Let's remember, refugees don't want to leave their homes. Muna spends so much of her life in Texas, or she calls it Taxi. I just got back from Taxi last week, in fact. She spends so much of her time in Texas thinking about her mom and her family and the love letters that her and Saka wrote each other that she hid under a specific tree near the hut where they lived. If it were up to her, like I think it's going on 70 years, this civil war in Burma.
Myanmar.
It's just Myanmar. Yeah, it's going on forever. It's the longest. I think it just hit the point of being the longest civil war in human history. Like if that civil war wasn't going on, I think she would move back in a heartbeat. At least early on in that piece. And her mom chose never to be resettled in the United States, even though she had the opportunity, because that was home for her. And Hasna, every step along the way, like even the process in which she went through to become a refugee was I'll start this process, but I'm planning on moving back in next week. Yeah. And that
she
opportunity
didn't want to take the call. She was like very surprised when she got the call from the UNHCR.
Well done.
Thanks.
Yeah. And by all accounts, her life in the United States is like harder than her life prior to, especially prior to the Syrian war.
She had to give up her Farus records and her rugs, her like really nice rugs that she saved for and were kind of like heirlooms. Her family, and she had a beautiful home. I love the description of her home, and her cooking, and that's I really enjoy learning about different cultures and tasting different food, and I really I wanted to like have Hasna make me a meal.
Right? Oh my goodness. She's got to be an incredible cook.
Right. But she had to give all of that up. And she ends up in a tiny apartment in Texas.
with her
with
injured
her
husband.
With her injured husband. He was almost killed by a missile in their house, and her daughter is there too, and it's like a 1-bedroom apartment, and
I'm right in thinking it's only Rana. It's only her youngest daughter, right?
yeah, no, yeah, only her youngest
Yusuf,
daughter.
Qasim, Amjad, Amal, Layla, like, they're not there. And in fact, the story ends, they're not together.
Right. It's a true story. And they have like these plastic these dishes that like just don't make any sense. You can't cook with. The apartment's poorly furnished, and for Muna, when she arrives, like the oven doesn't work. It's just not plugged in.
And the case manager never showed up.
Yeah, and the case manager never showed up. They were just in this apartment for 3 days.
Let's talk about how brave Muna is. This is a thing that I always fear, that when I share like information and statistics about refugees, there can be this idea that, oh, refugees are people that deserve our sympathy. And like we should feel bad for them and try to help. And like there's a certain aspect in which that is true. Like I would encourage us to move towards empathy instead of sympathy. But refugees, part of the process of being a refugee, honestly, especially if you're resettled in a country like the United States, like, is resilience, is virtue, and honor, and strength. Muna, when she arrives in the United States with her husband and their kids, like her oven isn't working. She doesn't even know really how to use it, but it's not working. There's a rotisserie chicken that isn't that great. And there's 4 apples, and that's all that is in their fridge. And she gets in, I think, on a Friday. And there's this thing that case managers are supposed to do a first day home visit, the first calendar day after a family arrives. You don't hear about this in the story. This is me just knowing the other side of it, which is just really fascinating reading it, because you're hearing about the experience, and I'm thinking like, okay, but like what was supposed to happen, or what is happening, and why does it feel that way? But nobody showed up that first day. And so they're like hungry. And she, like, with some money that she was given by the case manager or whoever it was that met them at the airport, she like ventures out of their apartment in Austin, Texas. Right? It's Austin, right? It's this, metropolitan area coming from a small refugee camp, not a tiny, but a smaller refugee camp, and like ventures across the street, finds a convenience store, gas station, convenience store, and purchases food while not being able to speak the language, having no idea how much money she has. She's just like hoping that, she has enough. She just hands them all the money, and the person there hands her money back. Like crossing streets and remembering. I mean, honestly, my memory is terrible. Like, she remembered where her apartment was. Like, if she didn't remember, like, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And it comes back, and, the level of bravery, I don't know if I would have that in me. Like, I would like to think I would, but I can't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the hard things is you're in America, which has this reputation of a land of milk and honey and whatever. And in many ways it is. And yet, Muna and her family and Hasna are like not prepared at all, or very little, And so they have to be incredibly brave, and yet nobody thinks that they have to. There's no, like, no one sees them as heroes in America, and when they are.
Yeah, I mean, and like Hasna is going from a place of being socioeconomically, they were not the wealthiest of the wealthy, but they were very like
They had a
middle
lot.
class, like they had a lot. And now in the United States, it's just her and her husband. Like, her husband was always the worker in the family, like ran a store and like amazing guy, but like he is injured and couldn't work. And her family is supposed to be arriving in the United States and be resettled with her, but then things changed, and the family reunification program was ended, and so her family wasn't able to be resettled in the United States. In fact, I think they're on like 4 different continents, or 4 different countries, or 3 continents. I don't know at this point. And so she has to become the primary bread earner for their family. I mean, she worked her whole life, but she didn't work, outside of the home.
Right.
And so, she found a kind of a cool gig working at a hairdresser with a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend. But then because she didn't have the right certificate of education or whatever, she was forced out of that because of the fear that the owner would call her out or whatever. And then she was working at a hotel as a room cleaner, and got injured and wasn't given workers' comp or anything. I liked your language, Hunter, of they're heroes, but we don't see them as heroes because we might not even see them.
Right.
And it's really hard one of the challenging things about entering this kind of line of, I don't even want to say line of work, but this type of living, intentionally living with the foreigner and refugees and other immigrants, like, and thinking about that and building relationships around that, is you run into stories all the time. They're like, these people are amazing. Or this individual has gone through so much, and refugees are just like you and I. The difference is their background. That's what they, their challenges in their life, and that's not to say that we haven't gone through challenges either. It's not the case. Even though sometimes I'm like, wow, my challenges don't count, which is not a healthy perspective and not true. But it's very challenging because as soon as you start walking alongside refugees, you realize the stories and the lack that exists in resources. And the mindset is then, well, let me provide all the resources. Like, these people should be in the best resources. They should have the best homes and all these. And that's not a healthy perspective to have either. It's this really amazing, tension that exists in everything. And it just, you turn one corner and the tension's higher, and then you turn the other, and there's more tension, and then you turn the other and you realize, the United States, we care about time so much. Other cultures, like, I think the United States is probably the most time-based culture in history.
I don't know about England. The British probably get it from them.
Maybe.
Thanks, Britain. I have a question. I was asking while I was reading this book. Wasn't quite answered. Is what what can we do practically, and then the other part is what can we do to fight apathy, and have hope, because they give the numbers, and you gave the number of 1% of refugees are resettled, and she talks about how I think it's Mike Pompeo in his speech about refugees kind of fudges some numbers together to make it seem like the U.S. has accepted a lot of refugees when they haven't. It's classic politics. Both sides do it.
Yep.
But also just like the percentage of refugees that the U.S. has resettled is just, it's like not even a drop in the bucket. It's like a mist. One water molecule. But yeah, what can we do, and how do we keep doing it?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Hunter. Before I answer that, I want to say that while the U.S.'s numbers are, not even a drop in the bucket, historically the United States has done, by sheer percentage of people, not percentage based off the size of our country and how many people we're welcoming in, but by the number of refugees resettled in the world, the United States actually has resettled a significant percentage. Depending on the specific time frame you're going to, you could find things as high as 50%. The United States has welcomed 3 million refugees since 1980, which is still less than 1% of our entire population if they were all to be welcomed this year at this moment, let alone over that entire course of time. So I want to say that the United States, and I think that this author, Jessica Goudeau, talks about that at the end. Like, hey, like the program that the United States has is still unique and amazing that it exists and pretty robust, even though it has such clear failings and shortcomings. So I want to say that positive thing about the United States. But there are 4 ways I'd encourage you to kind of keep this in front of your mind and acting on it. And the first is give. There are refugee resettlement agencies that resettle refugees, in addition to organizations that work with refugees in practically every town and city in our country. I promise you there are ones near you that you can get connected with. Look it up. I, of course, would always encourage people to give to World Relief, because the work we're doing is both here in the United States and globally, addressing core causes that would cause preventing people from needing to be refugees, in addition to welcoming and walking alongside refugees and immigrants and other immigrants in the process.
Give me some links to put in the show notes.
Yeah, I will. Actually, I have just the worldrelief.com. .org. I should know that. Great page to go to. You can see kind of the work we're doing, again, both in the United States and across the world. So find one to give. You could even, raise money through, for a birthday, to give to a refugee organization. Refugee resettlement organizations are almost always looking for furniture and stuff like that. So find an organization near you that works with refugees and is looking for furniture donations or other like cleaning supplies or clothing. And that's a really cool way, different ways to think around giving. The second is advocating. And I would say that is kind of twofold. the first aspect of it is just learning more. After the Last Border is a great book. There are a lot of other amazing books around refugees out there for all different ages. Check them out. A couple that come to mind. Welcoming the Stranger is a great one. There's so many going through my head. There are a couple kids books around refugees that are really great. The Girls in the Boat, I think is the name of a movie. There's really great documentaries out there. Anyways, that's an aspect of advocating is learning more. The other aspect is write letters to Congress, have conversations with family members. I'm going to send this piece to Hunter about World Relief. But there's an entire branch of what we do that is about advocating. And there's different types of like pre-written letters we have that you can send to your senator or senators. One of the big ones right now is around the Afghan Adjustment Act, which is a bill in front of Congress saying, hey, we need to provide a permanent pathway to citizenship for all of the Afghan arrivals who worked with our U.S. military who have arrived since the fall of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Because under current law, after 2 years in the United States, Afghan arrivals, because they came as humanitarian parolees, not as refugees, even though they meet the definition of a refugee, after 2 years, they will be sent back to their home country. Refoulement is the word for it, which can't happen.
Mm-hmm.
It not only shouldn't happen, like it can't happen. So advocating, pray. I think our country and our world and our culture, maybe our culture, I'll say, talks about prayer as being somewhat meaningless and just an empty platitude. But God responds to prayer. Prayer is active. Pray for the refugees that are arriving in the United States. Pray that you would pray that God would open up opportunities for you to build relationships with refugees and other immigrants. Pray for the conflicts that are happening in the world, those that you know of and those that you don't. That there would be justice and the swift end to them, so that refugees wouldn't need to seek resettlement in a different country, that they'd be able to go back home. And the last is serve. Find ways to get involved. Again, there are tons of refugee and other immigrant-facing organizations in our country that are doing amazing work. And I promise you that all of them are looking for people that can help out, whether it be one time or ongoing. I will give a push. The real way that you're going to see transformation in your life and in other people's is through ongoing relationships. And so I would push everybody to not think in terms of what can I do once, but what can I be doing regularly, to welcome other people, to be welcomed by them, and to be in relationship. So give, advocate, pray, serve. Help us fill in the gaps of the work we do.
Thanks, Eric. I know I definitely struggle with apathy. So easy to do. If you don't have a strong connection to keep you in contact or reason.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to do, not just because it's a good thing to do, but I think it's also good for us to stretch, to learn about other people, And I know from admittedly limited volunteer experiences that I've had that a lot of the time I end up feeling like I got more than I gave.
Oh yeah.
Maybe not financially, but just emotionally and
100%. The number of times I hear, "Oh, I came to serve other people, but I was served more." Like it sounds like a joke, but it is absolutely true.
some cliches are cliches for a reason.
Yeah,
They're true.
In our office, we talk about mutual transformation. That's our goal for all of our volunteers, for all of the churches we partner with, for all of our community partners, and for all of our clients. In relationship together, that we'll see mutual transformation. Because that's what happens when you're in a relationship. And Hunter, my life has been changed because of being friends with you. Like, I can't get around that.
It's mutual.
Yeah. And maybe that's a little bit more intense than some of my other friends. But it's true across the board. As you're in actual relationships with people, you're both transformed.
Yeah. Well, is there anything that you feel like we missed, something you wanted to say or leave us with?
I will say that we didn't talk too much about Muna and Hasna's stories. And a large part of that is because this book's so well written. I don't think we could say it better than this book. And because I would really invite you, our listeners, to hear the stories from their own voices. They're beautiful stories. Like we said, they'll bring you to tears. But I felt honored to be able to share in their stories.
Yeah.
To hear from them. And I think this is a book that will stick with me for a long time, even though the first time I read it was just a few months ago. Maybe 6 months ago now. I don't even know. Because it does such a good job of communicating the human story while also communicating the U.S. specific context. And it's really hard to do those things together.
Right. Yeah.
If you need a last encouragement to read this book, the quote across the top is from the New York Times Book Review. It says, "Simply brilliant. This book should be required reading."
Yeah, it's weird. Quotes like that always make me skeptical, but in this one, I would agree. It should be required reading. If nothing else, it will give you a new perspective on your own life, and maybe make you think about. It made me think about how fortunate I was to have my family and to be safe in a place where I can raise my family. Because for a lot of people, that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hunter, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time to read this.
I'm glad I did.
It means a lot to me that you did. And I am excited to bring other pieces that I've been reading and interacting with over the coming months into our discussions.
Yeah, I am too. I think it's, I need it. And I think other people do too.
Amen.